When I think about our practice, I think about all of the dimensions of health span. So when I use the word longevity, I'm referring to two things: lifespan, how long you live, and health span, how well you live.
Right.
And within health span, there's really three dimensions. There's a cognitive dimension, which I think most people kind of understand, right? How sharp is their brain? And most people can understand what the extreme loss of that looks like in the form of dementia. Then there's a physical dimension, the structural dimension, your ability to be free of pain, your ability to carry out activities of daily living, and your ability to do the things that you enjoy doing physically. And then there's an emotional component to this, right? So even though some people would touchy-feely call this mind, body, spirit, I really like to think of it as cognitive, physical / exoskeleton and emotional. I think it's that emotional bucket that is the hardest one for us in our practice to help patients with.
Right.
Because one, we don't have a great set of screening tools. We have really good screening tools for these other ones. And by the way, on the whole lifespan side, we have lots of great screening tools. We have biomarkers and MRI scanners and liquid biopsies and colonoscopies. I mean, we're very good at trying to identify the things that will end your life in a binary fashion from a cardiorespiratory standpoint.
Yep.
We're not very good at identifying the things that are going to end your life emotionally. I'm working on a book that's a day late, $1 short. It'll be out there eventually. But in it, I talk about 4 types of death. The first one being the one that people think of, cardiorespiratory pulmonary death, like the what I call death certificate death. But then I talk about these 3 other deaths: cognitive death. So the death of the ability of the brain, the decline of the ability of the brain with respect to, processing speed, short-term memory, long-term memory, executive function. The physical or exoskeleton death or demise, which is basically that which leaves a person in pain and unable to carry out these activities of daily living. And then this emotional death. And these 3 types of other death, types 2, 3, and 4, often precede one. In some ways, the perfect life would be a long life that just goes straight to type 1 death without detouring through type 2, type 3, and type 4. But tragically, that's almost never the case. And so we think so much about how to identify and treat type 2, type 3, and type 4, but by far the one in which we are the most limited is this identification of type 4. And part of it is, I think, shame. There's no question, right? Part of it is inadequacy of tools. So, for example, when it comes to identifying type 2 or type 3, let's use the physical one, we have so many ways that we assess people for movement and strength and balance and stability and stamina and all of these things. And usually once people are confronted with how bad they are, because almost always relative to our standards for where we want people to be, most people fall woefully short, but they can see, oh, this is where I should be if I subscribe to your ethos that to be a really kick-ass 100-year-old, I need to be a doubly kick-ass 50-year-old. And here are the steps that we're going to take to train to get you there. But I've, for years now, wanted to think, how could we do that same sort of screening around emotional health? And how would it be received? And how would we then implement therapy? Because really, a person who's doing very well on the type 1, type 2, and type 3, meaning they have no chronic diseases, they have no acute diseases, their mind is sharp, their body is great, but they're a slave to some shame that's rooted in trauma, they can often have the most miserable life. And really, how long they live becomes completely irrelevant. In fact, it almost becomes paradoxically a curse. It's just more time to suffer. A lot of these people, of course, are not obviously suffering, right? So it's very easy to see a person living in a crack house with needle tracks in their arm and say, are you suffering? Yes. I mean, that's not a huge cognitive leap for that person.
There are enough external markers that we can make that conclusion with a high degree of
And they're probably self-aware enough. But when you take somebody who's actually quite successful by all the metrics of the external world. They're successful financially. They have a wonderful family, all these other things. It usually takes a bit of prodding for them to acknowledge, and you have to be astute enough to prod and realize that actually all is not well. So I'm not a psychiatrist. How do I bring our evaluation of what I call type 4 death or demise up to the level of our ability to evaluate the other three? This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peterattiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.